So we're going to start at the top of Yud Aleph, and we're talking about Rav Huna, and this is a sugya in Tmura Daf Chav Gimel. He was mafresh chatos. It got lost. He designated a replacement chatos to replace the first one. He found the first one before he was makriv the second one. Rav Huna says that in midaito moshach achas mehen v'kriva, he chose one of them, and he was makriv it. And it doesn't matter which one he was moshech, whether he took the first one that was avuda or the second one that was never avuda. The other one is a chata shemesa, tomus. Why? Because that's one category of chata shemesa, which is called chata shekipru balea and dino lemisa. However, if let's say he didn't make a decision which of the two he wants to bring as a carbon, he comes to Bezdin, the Molech, to ask the guidance of Bezdin, which one of the two should he be makriv? On that we have machlokas. According to the Chachamim, asu takana b'kodshim. So the last thing that we discussed yesterday was this kind of takana b'kodshim. What is this takana b'kodshim? We want, as much as we can, possibly, to prevent that din of misa in a carbon. So the Chachamim made a takana that he should makriv the original carbon that was first designated as a chatas and then got lost. And therefore the shniya, the replacement chatas, since it was never avuda, it doesn't have the status of a chata shemesa, so we could spare the misa of a chatas and tira acha tistai. That's the shita of the Chachamim. Rebbe never accepted this takana, and he could be makriv the second carbon, second replacement animal, and he could also be right, and a shniya tamus, meaning the original chatos will now die because it comes under the category of chatos shekipru ba'aleh. Okay. So that's shita of Rav Huna. And just to summarize, as we discussed it yesterday, according to Rav Huna, if he decides that he wants to bring the replacement carbon, then the first carbon is Mesa. And if he comes to Bezdin, then we have machlokas between Rebbe and Chachamim. The Chacham say asu takana b'kodshim, and therefore they're going to instruct him to be makriv the Rishona, the first one that was not avuda. And according to Rebbe, there was no such takana. He could be makriv the eina avuda, the replacement carbon, and the original avuda will have to be left to die. It's a chata shekipru b'aleh. Now, according to Rebbe, who holds lo asu takana b'kodshim, and therefore we're going to allow him to bring the replacement carbon if he so chooses. That's the eina avuda, and the avuda will go for misa. Now we have machlokas rishonim, and according to one opinion in the rishonim, only in a case where the eina avuda, meaning the replacement carbon, is a superior carbon in relationship to the original carbon that was avuda. The second carbon, the replacement carbon, was shmena and muvcheres. And that's why Rebbe is in a quandary. He's got a conflict. He's got to choose between, like the lesser of two evils, so to speak, or the better of the two options. On the one hand, we want to save the avuda, and we want to prevent a situation of a chata shemesa. But on the other hand, Rebbe's of the opinion that we want to what's the word? We want to recommend using an animal that's muvchar. So even though there's a trade-off here, and for the purpose and the goal of hidur mitzvah, of beautifying the mitzvah, we would therefore recommend the Eina Avuda, meaning the replacement carbon, which is Shmena and Muvcheres, and we're going to forfeit now the Misa of the first carbon. That's one school of thought in the Rishonim. He writes in the footnote, it belongs to Tosfos. However, now we have another opinion, which is apparently Rabbinic Gershom, that according to Rebbe, in any event, no matter what the situation is, he should be makriv the replacement carbon, which is kind of paradoxical. Why are we advocating in favor of being makriv the replacement carbon, the Eina Avuda, at the expense of making the Avuda into a Chata Shemesa, and you don't gain anything because it's an animal that's on the same level, it's equal and uniform to the original animal, the Eina Avuda, there's no extra brownie points here of a hidur of Shmena and Muvcheres. So what would push Rebbe to prefer that we be makriv the Eina Avuda, the second carbon, the replacement carbon? And he says the following. This is at the end of footnote Reish Chav Tes. He says, Lefisha ba'avuda is yalid reusa shenevda. Interesting. The very fact that he lost the first carbon, he may have put a little ribbon around it so he could identify it, but basically it jumped into the herd and it's mixed with all the other animals that are chulin. He has no way of knowing 100% sure. There's already a bit of a reusa, or maybe there's a new Chal Hashem reusa called Avuda that's Chal in the Gufa Be'ema. The very fact that it got lost and it was left unsupervised, that itself puts it on a lower level. And therefore, when he has a choice as to which of these two korbanos he should bring, we advocate in favor of the Eina Avuda, the replacement carbon. All this is according to Rav Huna. Now we get to Rabbi Abba, which is also the same sugya on Daf Chav Gimel. Ein chiluk bein mashach bidaito lebali malach. There's no difference in halacha between the Bailim making on their own initiative, making their own decision, or asking Bezdin, what do they recommend? What is therefore the machlokas between Rebbe and Chachamim? So we're talking about a case of hiskaper be'avuda. He chose to bring the original carbon. He's not impressed with Rabbeinu Gershon's reifsa. That was the original carbon. That was up front. It was first designated for his chatos. That's the one he should bring. And he'll decide to bring it, and Bezdin will agree and approve that he should bring the first chatos, the chatos of Avuda. So now he brings the Avuda and he achieves kapara. And now the question is, what do we do with the Eina Avuda, with the replacement carbon, which now becomes basically a chatas shekipru balel? He says, "Ilu bi ofen sheskaper b'she'ena avuda." If he will bring the second carbon, the replacement carbon, which doesn't have the status of avuda, was never lost, then what's going to happen is the avuda, the original carbon, tamus. It becomes niskapru balel. So therefore, there cannot be any machlokas between Rebbe and Chachamim about a case where he was makriv the Eina Avuda, everybody would agree that the Avuda therefore is Lemisa because it's this Kapru Balel. But the Machlokas is in a case where he brought the Avuda, right? He found the original carbon and he brought that carbon. And what is the Machlokas? L'chachamim. Well, let's start with Rebbe. I think it's a lot easier because Rebbe is intuitive. Rebbe says that the second carbon, the replacement carbon, is Tamus because it's this Kapru Balel. It's a Chatach and it's Kapru Balel. The Chachamim say, no. We're not going to force a Misa halacha here on the Ein Avuda because it never had the status of an Avuda. So that Chatosh and its Kapru Balea, according to the Chacham, requires a second condition in order to be Lemisa. It's not only Shenitz Kapru Balea, but it also was an Avuda. And this second carbon was never an Avuda. But according to Rebbe, it's a classic case of Chatosh and its Kapru Balea, and therefore the second carbon, which was not an Avuda, is the Misa. And Rebbe adds the following: Hamafrish le'ibud ki'ibud damin. In other words, when you're mafrish a carbon as a replacement carbon, so that it's tachas avuda, then it has the same status as the carbon that's replacing. It's like lahavdil in baseball, you call in a pitcher from the bullpen, you don't start the game all over again. He picks up exactly where the game was holding under the first pitcher. And that's the same thing here in a mushal. The Eina Avuda now steps into the shoes of the Avuda to replace it and gets the same status and the psul of Avuda. V'arei Avuda. And therefore, now we have both conditions that are filled. It's Nevda, and it's also Kipru Balea, and therefore it's Lemisa. Now the Gemara has a third shita. He doesn't give you the name. Apparently, the Gemara quotes an anonymous Amora. The Gemara just says, Shalo Kirabi Abba. Nechleku Chachamim v'Rebbe. There will be a machlokas Rebbe and the Chachamim, even in the case where he was makriv the second carbon. Why? L'chora, if he was makriv the second carbon, then the first carbon, the original one, which is the avuda, has both conditions. It's niskapru balea and it's avuda, and therefore it should be lemisa. No, the avuda is not lemisa. Why? Because it was not avuda b'shas kapara, meaning at the moment that they brought the kapara, the second carbon, the first carbon was no longer avuda. Hainu shenimtzas. So 1 second. Mishum shenemar din misa afka bavuda b'shas kapara. Hainu b'nintzeis li'achar shekarva shniya. So when is chatos mesa according to Chachamim? That's when they found the original carbon, which is now lemisa, after they already brought the second carbon and he achieved his kapara through the replacement carbon. If before the kapara was brought on the mizbeach, he had located his original carbon, in other words, it loses its status as an avuda because it's not avuda, even though it was not brought on the mizbeach. But you can't call it an avuda because you have it at the critical moment of that krav al gabi mizbeach. That's the sheet of the chacham. Well, the shitas Rebbe af avuda v'shas hafrasha, even though the halacha is that it was avuda b'shas hafrasha. That for sure is mesa. Nobody questions that. No, I'm sorry. It was not avuda b'shas kapara, but it was avuda b'shas hafrasha. Meaning at the moment that they were mafresh the replacement carbon, the original chatos was avuda. And that's enough to generate the status of avuda. So whereas the chacham put all the emphasis on shas kapara, the moment in which the carbon was brought and the bailam one is kaper, and it was not an avuda, and therefore it's not lemisa, Rebbe puts all the emphasis on shas hafrasha. And the moment of hafrasha, the replacement, the shniya, the rishona, was avuda, and therefore that's the status of mesa. Lefichach im afilu im nimtzeis harishona kolm sheikrim zashniya keeper b'shniya reyishona tamus me'achet sheb'chas hafrasha hois avuda. La halacha pasak haramim kechachamim ukerav huna. So that means that the chacham have this asu takana b'kodshim, and therefore, in order to prevent and avoid misa for the carbon, they established that he should be makriv the avuda, and the shnio is tireh ad shetistai because it was never lost. If, on the other hand, he, the bailam, on his own initiative, decided to be moshech the eina avuda, then the avuda becomes lemisa. Hifrish chatos v'ovda, v'hifrish acheres tachtev v'nimtzeis harishona kodem akrovas hashniya. So now he's about to be makriv the replacement carbon. He locates the first carbon, and lo and behold, to his surprise and maybe chagrin, harishona balas mum. It has a mum, which means that there's no option whatsoever to bring the first carbon. And we just finished saying that the Rabbana made a takana that he should bring the original carbon, but we can't do so because it has a mum. And in the footnote here, Reish Lamed Hey points out that imkvar nofal amum kodem sha'avda, if it was already a balas mum and then he lost it, so l'chora, does it have a din of avuda? And it depends upon, he's got a whole list of achronim. But now we're talking about a case where it was avuda. He designated a replacement. He finds the original carbon, and yet, to his surprise, it's a balas mum. Yeshmin Arishonim is on the top left column of Yud Aleph Hasover Sha'af Lefi Shitas HaGemara. Even according to the Gemara on the anonymous third opinion of the Gemara, which is called Shitas HaGemara. It's not Rav Huna, it's not Rabbi Abba, it's just the Shitas HaGemara. And according to Shitas HaGemara, is Lidas Chachamim Nimtzeis Rishona Kodem HaKrovas HaShniya V'Niskaper B'Shniya Eina Rishona Mesa, because if at the time the kapara was no longer avuda, the chacham hold it loses its status of avuda, and therefore it doesn't generate a din of misa. So amru din zeh ela b'nitzeis harishona tmiyama. How and when can you be mafkia the shema avud? That's only if it's roilim is back. It's no longer avud. But if you located it, you found it, but to your surprise, it has a mum and it's not roilim is back, then it still remains an avuda. After he's makriv the shniya, it's niskapru abaylim, and it's also avuda. Why? Because he found it and it has a mum. He avuda v'gam he balas mum. I'm not sure why he doesn't mention Niskapu Balea here. Reish Lamed Zayin. He says, Afil L'chachamim Shenimtzeis Kodem Kapara Lo Tamus, it loses its status of Avuda. Mikomakom Zu Mesa Sheish Batar to the race. So because it's not only Avuda, it's also Balas Mum. Oh, he says, I think he's asking our question. Hikshu Atosis, Meachash and his Kaper B'Shnia, Sheina Balas Mum came L'Shitas Rav Huna Rav Abba, Gam L'chachomim Tomus, Afilo Hoisa Balas Mum. Sharei Hakol Modim is Kapra, B'Sheina Avuda, Shedin Avuda L'Mesa, L'Misa. But according to the Shita Shlishis, right, the Shita Sagamara, according to Chachamim, even if Niskaper Bishnia, Ein Havuda Mesa, the first one is not Mesa. Why? Because we found it. So therefore, Midin Niskapru Baleha, if it's an Ein Havuda, then it doesn't have a din of Mesa. But here it's considered Avuda because it's a Balas Mum. Yesh min harishonim hasover lehepo. Sha'af lefi shitas Rav Huna v'Rabbi Abba that niskaper b'she'ena avuda din avuda lemisa, that if he brought the second carbon, the replacement carbon, on the mizbeach, then the original carbon that was lost is lemisa, and that applies even if he found it before they were makriv the second carbon. Lo amru din zel b'nimtzeis avuda tmima. When do we say, according to these amoraim, that the original carbon is lemisa? That's only if it's a tmima. Whoa, this is counterintuitive. Ach b'nimtzeis avuda balas mum is hadin cholak b'zem nimtzeis kodem kapara. I see what he's saying. This is a whole different logical approach. He's now saying that once it becomes a balas mum, then that's its status. Forget about the fact that it was a chatos, a chatos shenevda. Leave that out. It became a balmum. The status of balas mum is that it's yirad sheyistayim. Is benimtzeis havuda balas mum, venimtzeis kodem kapara. Oh, I don't know why it's kodem kapara. Let's see. Is then afli acher sheniskaper b'shnia ein harishona mesa ledina l'raya v'im nimtzeis liacher kapara. So then, once the kapara was achieved, then it's an avuda, and therefore it's a chatos hamesa. Even though he found it, and it has a balmum, tomus. Now he's got a gigantic footnote on this, but just on the surface level, without the pilpul in the footnote, there are two shitos here that go from one extreme to the other, in a sense. I mean, according to the first shita, we said that since he found the Rishona and it was a balas mum, just 1 second. Since he found the Rishona and it was a balas mum, Therefore, it's got a double raise, and therefore for sure it goes to Misa. Even though he found it before, he relocated the first carbon before he brought the second carbon. But nevertheless, what he found was a balas mum. So if you add that together with the fact that it was nevda, so you've got avuda and you've got balas mum. The other shita says that even according to the, right, because the first shita is trying to explain the shita sagamara. Now we're going on to Rav Huna and Rabbi Abba. And we're saying that even according to them, if he brought the kapara with the second string carbon and the ein avuda, then the avuda is lemisa. But that's because it was found tmima. But if you find and locate the avuda and it's a balas mum, then if you found it before the kapara, there's no din of misa. So basically saying that you could be mafkia, the shame avud, even though, despite the fact that it's what? It's a balas mum. Right? In the first sheet, we said that balas mum is a tarti l'reis, so it's avuda and it's a balas mum, and therefore it's l'misa. Now we're saying that it's no longer an avuda because we found it before the kapara, before the replacement carbon was brought on the mizbech, and that's true despite the fact that it's a balas mum. So according to the second shita here in the Rishonim, I have a feeling that balas mum is a plus, not a minus. How is that so? Why would balas mum be a plus? That's what I'm trying to figure out. That's what we suggested before, that balas mum is a status unto itself. It generates new dinim, and even in a carbon that would normally be considered a chatos hamesa, but we can salvage the carbon, so to speak, and it still obviously can't be brought in the mizbeach, but by virtue of the fact that it's a bal mum, we give it a status of a bal mum, which in this case would generate a loch of yirat chistoy. Okay, just one more short paragraph. Hifrish chatos v'ovda, v'hifrish acheres tachtel, yachar shekvar shachat, v'kibel dama shel hashniya nimtzeis harishona. So is this considered nimtzeis kodem kapara? Because there was no zrika yet. There was only shchita and kabbalah sadam. And the kapara, the mechaper, is dependent upon the zrika. Now you found the original carbon before the zrika, and therefore it's considered nimtzeis kodem kapara. And in nimtzeis kodem kapara, right, before the kapara of the shnia, then we have a shita, for example, of Rav Huna, that we can prevent the din of misa in the case of nimtzeis rishona kodem kapara. Again, according to Rav Huna, you'll have machlokas tanoim whether or not the Chachamim made a takana that they should bring the Rishon or not. Okay, that's a different machlokas, but fundamentally, once you find the original carbon before the second carbon as a kapara was brought on the Mizbeach, and you haven't yet achieved kapara, then it loses its status as an avuda. In fact, Rabbi Abba said that since you found the original carbon, and therefore you could have brought it on the Mizbeach, just 1 second, let me go over this one more time. So again, according to Rabbi Abba, if he brought the avuda, okay, so that's the case where he brought the avuda. But let's go back to Rav Huna. Rav Huna has a case where, let's say he was makriv the Eina avuda, just 1 second. What happens? He shechted the carbon, he was makabel adam. Now he finds the Rishon. So we're going to say that it's nimseis kodem kapara. Okay, so let me just underline it. So nimseis kodem kapara, according to one side in the Gemara. So now if it's nimseis kodem kapara, then we can possibly bring the first carbon. I think that's what he has in mind. Let's be makriv the original chatos on the Mizbeach, right? Because let's say according to Rav Huna, in the Shita of the Chachamim, there was a takana of Kodshim to avoid and prevent a situation of Misa. We're going to be makriv the avuda. Yeah, but in this case, can you be makriv the avuda if you already did the shchita and the kabbalah sadam of the Eina avuda? Yeah, you know what? This makes a lot of sense according to the Shita Sagamara, the third Shita, because in the third Shita, the Chacham hold there's no din of Avuda Mesa because it was no longer Avuda B'Shas Kapara. Oh, now it fits like a glove. Okay, that's what I was missing. In other words, when he finds it before the Kapara, then it's no longer considered Avuda and it's not Mesa. And that's going to apply even if he was Miskaper with the She'ena Avuda. So here in this case, once he finds the original carbon before the Zrikas Adam of the Shnia, then it's before Kapara. And if it's before Kapara, according to the third Shita, it is not considered an Avuda. and therefore there's no din of visa. Okay, so let's make a note of where we got up to here. Okay. Okay.